Good afternoon. This is Amanda Berkson-Chilcock at National Skills Coalition, and I'm welcoming you to our webinar on service workers with limited foundational skills, what new data tells us and how employers and policymakers can respond. This webinar accompanies a new report that NSC has just released, and I'm really glad to have all of you with us here today to hear about and dig a bit deeper into some of our findings. Before we get started, a quick word of thanks to those who helped us put this report together. First and foremost, to you and your peers. There are folks listening to the webinar today who graciously gave their time and energy either for phone interviews as key informants for the report or in responding to a survey that we did last summer asking you about examples of adult learners that you had worked with who were working in the service sector. So your input really helps sort of enrich and liven the findings that we have in this report, and we very much appreciate your time. A big thank you also to our research partners at the American Institutes for Research, particularly Jasmine, Emily, and Katie, who were just instrumental in helping us with the data analysis piece of this report. And then, of course, to the Walmart Foundation for their financial support. And you see the disclaimer on the slide here. While we thank the Walmart Foundation for their support, we acknowledge that the findings, conclusions, and recommendations presented in this report are those of National Skills Coalition and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the foundation. Okay, so we're going to throw a bunch of information at you today, and I wanted to sort of give you a recap slide right at the beginning with the 3 takeaways that I really hope that you're going to leave with after today's discussion. And so the first really is that while adult learners and workers come up with oftentimes really ingenious coping mechanisms to deal with the fact that they have limited literacy skills or limited math skills, skill gaps really are an invisible drag on productivity, and it's one that affects not just individual workers, but their co-workers and the companies that employ them. The second thing I hope you remember is that while many people think of service jobs as high turnover jobs, in reality we found that for the low-skilled workers we were studying for this report, well over half, 58%, were staying at least 3 years with their current employer. So they really are worth investing in from an economic perspective as well as from a human perspective. And then finally, we're going to share some examples of really innovative employer interventions, but we know that those interventions are really only going to be able to go to scale if we have strong public policies at the state and federal level to enable those kinds of innovative policies to be scaled up. So if you don't remember anything else from what we talked about today, I hope you remember those 3 points. Okay, so let's dig in. We're going to talk first about worker demographics. The data set we used for this report is called the PIAAC, and you can see a little bit more about it on this slide here. It is a cross-national data effort, the Survey of Adult Skills, overseen by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. And we looked at U.S. data for this report. If you'd like to dig deeper into what the PIAAC consists of and how it's administered and all those other good things, I put the URL for the PIAAC Gateway, which is sort of the central website, on the slide here in red so you can dig deeper. So let's talk about the particular subset of adult learners and workers that we looked at for this report. We looked at folks who are working age, 16 to 64, and currently employed. And that's important, right? We made a decision not to include everyone in the labor force that is also unemployed people who are currently looking for work. We really wanted to focus very specifically on people that are definitely already in the workplace, so they're currently working. And then we define service sector in this case as retail, accommodation, and food service, which you can think of more colloquially as hospitality or sort of restaurants, hotels, that sort of thing. And then some entry-level healthcare, or what PIAAC refers to as health and social work industries. Interesting limitation on the data, which I'm going to talk about in a few more slides, is that the background questionnaire that we drew a lot of our findings from is only administered in English or Spanish. So it only captures people who can speak one of those two languages. We defined low skill, as you can see on the slide here, with people scoring at or below level 2 for literacy or numeracy, or level 1 for what PIAAC refers to as problem solving in technology-rich environments, which is a bit of a mouthful, and which we talk about in this report as digital problem solving skills. And then finally, PIAAC captures data on people at 4 occupational skill levels. We excluded the folks at the highest of those skill levels. That is, people who would traditionally be employed in professions like lawyers, doctors, that sort of thing, under the assumption that very few of them would have the low skills that we were looking at for this particular review. So what did we find? Well, this is the sort of take-home slide. Across the 3 service sector subsectors that I just talked about, that is to say retail, accommodation and food service, and health and social work, low skills are prevalent. And not just low literacy, but also low numeracy and digital problem-solving skills, as you see in this chart here. So this is a widespread challenge. And more importantly, because a lot of folks sort of say, well, these are young sectors, right? These, a lot of young folks get their first job in fast food or in as a retail associate, and that's not untrue. About a quarter of these workers are ages 16 to 24, but that means that 3/4 of them are older than age 25, and frankly, half of them are older than age 35. So we aren't just talking about young people, and I think that's really important to acknowledge. These are folks who have been in the workforce for a while, who may have families to take care of, who may have other responsibilities, and frankly, that has implications for what kind of fixes we want to suggest for workers who want to upskill, but frankly also the public policies that can enable those workers to actually pursue those upskilling opportunities. So I really wanted to pull that fact out because I know it's often a kind of unspoken assumption. It's also a pretty diverse group of folks. The plurality, 46%, are white. A fairly large chunk, about 1 in 5, are Black or African American. A quarter are Hispanic, and then 5% Asian Pacific Islander, and 4% other. About 1 out of 4 are immigrants, and 29% speak English as their second or third language. I do want to go back to that point that I mentioned earlier, which is the background questionnaire is only given in English and Spanish. So if you are a Vietnamese speaker and your English is not yet strong enough to be taking, a background questionnaire, you are not showing up in this data. So that's important to acknowledge because there are about 1 in 6 workers in the U.S. workforce today was born abroad, and so we can safely assume that the PIAAC data is somewhat of an undercount when we think about folks who speak languages other than English or Spanish not being captured in this data. And most of the workers in the categories that we studied are parents. 2/3 of them have children. So that's an important thing, again, to think about, both in terms of the challenges that people may face if they have child care needs or other issues that might prevent them from engaging in upskilling, but also in terms of the benefit. We know that the best predictor for children's educational attainment is the educational attainment of their primary caregiver as a young child, which is often their mother. So for those of you who work on 2-generation issues, I wanted to make sure to flag this finding. I think it's pretty notable. So here's another notable finding. A lot of the low-skilled folks that we studied are people who have a high school diploma or equivalent. 2/3 have a high school diploma or equivalent, and a handful have even gone farther to get an associate's or bachelor's degree. And I think this is indicative of a couple of things. First of all, there are folks, and I know this is not news to anybody on today's call, who are getting out of our K-12 educational system in this country who really don't have the basic literacy and numeracy skills they need to be successful. And secondly, think back to the age slide, right? This is not just about people who maybe graduated from school 5 minutes ago. Some folks may have been away from school for a while, and that can also be playing into the findings here. And we heard a lot of really frank stories from many of you in our key informant interviews about what the human cost of having these low skills can really look like in the workplace. People are saying things like, I'll take this memo home to read tonight, meaning I'll have my spouse read it to me or I'll have my child read it to me. People are saying, I forgot my glasses. People are really coming up with all kinds of ingenious workarounds to either avoid showing that they have literacy or numeracy gaps or sort of compensate for the fact that they do. So you see one particular story that we heard on the slide here. So let's talk now about the actual circumstances of folks on the job, right? You just heard about their demographics. Now we're going to shift to their sort of work context. Overall, just under 1 in 3 service workers with low skills are employed at small to mid-sized companies, but a much higher percentage are at locations with fewer than 250 employees, and frankly, many of them far fewer than that, right? Fewer than 100 employees or fewer than 50 employees. Why does this matter? Well, 2 reasons. One, service work almost uniquely means that if I pull you off the floor to engage in a training activity, I have to replace you with somebody else, right? I can't just be down a cashier or I can't just be down a home health aide. That's going to have ripple consequences for the rest of my customers or patients. So when we think about upskilling and we think about the fact that so many of the folks that we're talking about as being the population in need of this upskilling and adult education, we also have to acknowledge that in the service sector, the employer challenge is if I pull you off the floor to engage in upskilling, I got to find somebody to replace you, and that can be both expensive and logistically challenging. If you think about a relatively small workplace, you may just not have enough warm bodies, frankly, to cover for all the shifts that need to be covered. So that can be a complicating factor, and I wanted to sort of lift that up to make sure we highlighted it. So this slide is also probably not a surprise to any of you who think about these issues, but overwhelmingly, service sector workers have low earnings. And we're looking here at a comparison of low-skilled service workers compared to all low-skilled workers. And so the service workers are in blue, and you can see that almost 80% of service workers, are in the bottom 2 quintiles, right? So if you divide everybody's monthly earnings into 5 groups, they're in the bottom 2 of those 5 groups. So that has a number of implications, right? The first is it means that workers often are working 2 jobs or working a lot of hours, right? Because if their jobs don't pay very well, then they really have to hustle to make sure they have enough money coming in. The second thing it means is that oftentimes folks don't have a lot of money themselves to pay for education and training opportunities. So even if the education or training opportunity only costs a couple $100 or some other relatively modest tuition fee, that can be a very big reach for somebody whose earnings are particularly low. So I just wanted to flag this. I don't think it's news to anybody who studies labor market issues that service sector workers tend to have low earnings, but it's pretty stark, and I wanted to lift it up. So here's a really interesting finding. Even though people have these skill gaps, they are employed in jobs that actually call upon them to use these skills regularly. And regularly, in many cases, means every day, right? So this slide refers to things like how often you have to read letters and emails, how often you have to write letters or memos, how often you have to calculate prices or costs or budgets, how often you have to use a computer. And the answers on this slide encompass both, actually 3 categories of every day, every week, or at least once a month. But at least half of each one of these variables represents people who have to use this skill every day. So a lot of folks will say, well, workers may have limited skill gaps, but hey, they're working, so they must be able to sort of muddle through. Well, this slide sort of says folks are really stretched, right? They might be really using a lot of those coping mechanisms or workarounds, which is frankly inefficient for both the worker and the company. And they're not just in jobs where they're folding clothes in a stockroom or something, but they actually are called upon to use these skills on a pretty regular basis. And there's another finding that I was frankly a bit surprised by, and I don't yet have a full explanation for. So I'd love to hear your hypotheses on this when we have a chance to discuss this report further. When we looked at how often workers with low literacy skills said they had to use a computer on the job, just over half of them said they were regularly using a computer. When we looked at people with low digital problem-solving skills, an even higher number of them said they regularly had to use computers on the job. So people are constantly having to use technology on the job even though they really don't have the sort of baseline skills that they need to be comfortable and effective with it. So I think that's a really notable finding, even though I frankly can't fully explain the difference there between low literacy and low tech skills. Okay, so we also sort of looked at the question of, for lack of a better word, stagnation, right? What's going on with folks at their current jobs? And a strong majority of folks are continuing to learn new things on the job, including 1 out of 3 who say they are learning new things every day, and another quarter or so who are learning new things once a week or more. So that's pretty notable. And I wanted to flag that, but I also wanted to flag this accompanying slide, which is that these workers are also teaching other people on the job, right? So it's not just that they're behind a cash register or stocking shelves or caring for a patient, but they're actually teaching their coworkers how to do jobs. And a quarter of them are teaching every day, and another 15% at least once a week. So again, not a small number. So we alluded to this at the front end of the webinar, and I really wanted to come back to it. 58%, that's the 22% and the 36% you see added together, have been with their current employer for at least 3 years. And that includes 36%, or 1 in 3 workers who have been at least 6 years at their current employer. So this is a sort of double-edged finding, right? On the one hand, it is definitely true that this is showing that folks are loyal and folks are dedicated and they are staying with their employer long enough for an investment in their skills to be worth it. On the other hand, it could also be a symptom that if folks' skills are low enough, they are sort of staying stuck at their current job and they're not able to do the time-honored American way of getting a better job or getting better wages, which is changing jobs. So it's really something that is important, I think, to flag and acknowledge as we think about these issues. This was another really notable finding. 1 out of 4 workers with low skills are supervising other workers. That's not a small number, and I think it indicates things both in the realm that if workers have limited basic skills themselves, they may be challenged to do things like employee performance evaluations or developing a time schedule or a budget for their department. But it also just sort of has other general spillover effects in terms of not being able to sort of fully participate in perhaps relaying information from the home office. If their reading skills aren't strong and they're not confident in reading the memos and the communications folks are getting, perhaps if they are part of a larger company. So this was pretty notable. And of that 1 in 4 who are supervisors, half of those supervisors are overseeing at least 6 people. So that was also a pretty notable finding. So that tells you a bit about folks' working situations. I want to talk now about what workers are doing to help themselves build skills. And our data analysis found that more than 1 in 3 had recently pursued a learning opportunity. So recently in this case means within the past 12 months. And at least a quarter of workers had pursued a formal degree or certificate in the past year, and you can see that others had engaged in other types of learning opportunities. And most folks who are pursuing these are doing it for job-related reasons, right? Overwhelmingly, almost 2/3 you can see. It's also the case for workers specifically who are pursuing degree programs. Now this slide has a lot going on, so I want to just sort of separate out 2 things. The top 2 bars, the red and the light blue, are why are you pursuing your degree, right? And 2/3, 69%, say job-related reasons. Then the bottom 4 bars, the gold, green, gray, and dark blue, are asking, okay, if you are pursuing your degree, is it useful for your current job? And here we have 1 in 3, 34%, saying it's not at all useful for my current job. So that's a mirror image, right? 2/3 are saying they're doing their degree for job-related reasons, and yet 1/3 are saying, well, it's not actually that useful for my current job. So what that tells us is that people are probably thinking of their degree or certificate program as something that they are pursuing for a future job or their future employability, more so than the exact job they have today. We also looked at folks who either weren't participating at all in learning opportunities and wanted to, or who would have liked to have participated more. And this is a complicated slide with a lot going on here, but it can be boiled down very simply. Lack of time and money are the top reasons that workers don't participate. And I call this the sort of no-duh slide, right? Because any of us who work in this field, if you asked us off the top of our heads, what would be the reasons that people would have difficulty participating in learning opportunities, we would say lack of time and lack of money. And that can look different in different contexts, right? Sometimes it's, well, I have child care, family responsibilities. Sometimes it's, well, the course wasn't offered at a convenient time. So the slide is useful in sort of breaking out some of that in a little more detail, but the sort of take-home message is pretty straightforward. We also looked at whether employers helped cover the cost of any of the learning activities or training programs that workers were engaged in. And employers were dramatically more likely to help with the cost of other types of learning activities rather than a diploma, degree, or certificate program. We can imagine a lot of reasons for that, but I think probably one reason is that those programs are more likely to be time limited, right? So if I'm in a degree program, you as my employer might not know whether I will stay with your company long enough for your investment to pay off, especially if my degree program is going to take me several years. On the other hand, if I want to go to a 6-week course or a 12-week course, you can be reasonably certain that I'm going to stick with you long enough for that to sort of pay off. And then, of course, the other very straightforward interpretation here is that degree programs are more expensive, right? Covering somebody's tuition to attend a diploma, degree, certificate program is going to be more expensive than covering their cost for perhaps a short-term program in, say, food handling, or a short-term program in sort of patient confidentiality or some other kind of upskilling that is a brief intervention and not a longer-term program. We also heard quite a number of stories, both that we saw emerging from the data analysis, but frankly also from our key informant interviews, about the role of technology in adult learning. And relatively small numbers of workers reported that they had actually participated in open or distance education programs in the past year. You see it's 13% on the slide here. And our key informants shared a lot of very blunt stories, and I've got a couple on the next couple of slides here. Some key informants really talked about how online-only classes were just a real barrier for a lot of the adult learners they worked with, that they took more sort of organization and sort of competence in navigating a higher education or even just a regular education realm than their students necessarily had comfort with. At the same time, we also heard some really positive and optimistic stories about blended learning approaches, where folks are combining an online learning component or a remote learning component with an in-person component. Some people call this flipped classroom. Some people call it blended learning. There are different sort of flavors and varieties of how it gets implemented, but that was definitely something that came through loud and clear from a number of our key informants. So that takes us through the data analysis part of our report. I want to turn now to sharing some employer examples of how employers are approaching these issues at the ground level. So the first example comes from the Boston area. Beth Israel is a major medical center with thousands of employees, and they observed that they were having vacancy problems in a couple of key occupations, and I flagged one of them on the slide here, which is surgical technologist. And their solution to that was to create an in-house training program and to allow current workers at the medical center to apply for that program in a competitive process, right? So it's not just that you automatically get into it. You have to really demonstrate that you're sort of intrinsically motivated to participate. But in return, the training is offered part-time so that you can keep working while you're participating in it, and it's offered at little or no cost to the worker. And then you're guaranteed a opportunity to get a job in that occupation when you finish the training, sort of in good standing. So that's one approach, and that can be a really workable approach, particularly for larger employers who have the sort of internal capacity to do that. But many workers and companies in the service sector, as we talked about, are in small and mid-sized businesses, and so they can't necessarily all provide in-house training opportunities. So another way to tackle this challenge is through industry sector partnerships. And industry sector partnerships bring together multiple employers in the same industry to talk about their talent development needs and basically do what we call aggregate talent demand. Okay, you're going to hire 3 certified nurse aides this year, and you down the street are going to hire 5 certified nurse aides, and you over here are going to hire 3. So all together, we're going to be having this number of job openings in this occupation in the coming year. And what can be really effective about industry sector partnerships is when the partners come together, they can not just identify their training needs and their gaps, but also what are the pathways for advancement, right? So how do we see people moving up from a hotel housekeeping job to a more front of house job like a guest services rep? Or how do we see people moving up from a home health job into higher level healthcare jobs? And the particular example we're highlighting here is also from the Boston area, the Hospitality Training Center offered through Bestcorp, and that happens to be a labor management partnership where the labor union has collective bargaining agreements with a number of hotels in the Boston area, and the Hospitality Training Center receives funds as part of the collective bargaining agreement. So a little tiny percentage of the worker's wages, essentially, by agreement of both the worker and the employer, gets diverted into this training fund and then used to help upskill workers and encourage, provide for the training of new workers in the industry. So another opportunity that employers can pursue is to be the employer partner for a registered apprenticeship program. Many of you may be familiar with the idea of apprenticeships or work-based learning in the building trades, right, where you are an electrician or you are a mason or you are a welder, and you're going through a several-year process and you are getting paid at the same time. But in recent years, the federal government has really made a big push to expand apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs beyond the building trades. And one example of those comes from Central Pennsylvania at the Fusco U Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, where they've created a CNA, a Certified Nurse Aide Apprenticeship. Because this part of Central Pennsylvania is pretty rural, they've used a flipped classroom approach that combines both online learning and in-person learning. So that's another example of how employers are tackling this. Another example comes through vocational English tailored for the specific industry. So this particular example is a partnership with the National Immigration Forum, which is an immigrant advocacy organization, Miami-Dade College and other community colleges, and the 3 grocery stores that you see on the slide here. And the goal here is really to help existing store workers improve their English skills so that they can be qualified for a promotion. And I'm happy to say that this program, of course, is also funded by Walmart, as with our report, and they have a terrific one-pager on the National Immigration Forum website that talks about the specific outcomes for the adult learners in this program and what their results have been in terms of being able to move up on the job. So I encourage you to check that out at the National Immigration Forum website. The project is called Skills and Opportunity for the New American Workforce. And I think it's a great example of really demonstrating the outcomes that an adult learning intervention can have. So another tack that employers can take is to participate in integrated education and training, or IET models. Some of you may know this from the IBEST model, Integrated Basic Education and Skills Training, that started in Washington State a little over 10 years ago. The 2 examples we have on our slide here, Friendly House is a community-based nonprofit in Phoenix, Arizona. The International Institute is a nonprofit in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And both of these are collaborations with community colleges and employers to provide occupational training and basic skills training at the same time, one in healthcare and one in hospitality. So those are a couple of really interesting examples, and there are different sort of flavors of IET in different communities around the country. So I encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in, to dig deeper in that. And then finally, the sort of last opportunity for employers is to really help their incumbent workforce get industry-recognized certification, right? And so that certification can look different depending on your industry. Building Skills Partnership helps employees who are janitors in a number of different office buildings in California to earn the U.S. Green Building Council Green Janitor Certification, which means that you as a janitor are certified to work in a LEED certified building, an environmentally friendly building. So you know how to practice energy efficiency practices and appropriate waste management and environmentally conscious sort of like bulb disposal and all those good things. And the other example comes from McDonald's, which has a pretty robust Archways to Opportunity program that includes GED or high school equivalency, it includes English as a second language, and it includes opportunities to earn industry-recognized credentials. And so one of the ones that I flagged here is the Certified Professional Food Manager credential. So those are some examples of how employers can help their workers to build skills either on the job or that are going to be relevant for their jobs. I want to share with you a couple of the sort of on-the-ground examples. And I know that many of you on today's webinar are yourselves program providers, you are adult educators, you are workforce development professionals, and so you probably have many stories like this from your own experience. But I think it's important when we're talking about these issues, we're often talking at kind of the 30,000-foot level. We're talking about populations of people and statistics, to really bring it back to the personal level and say, what does it mean for an individual worker when they get this kind of support so that they can really achieve mobility? And so there are a couple of really lovely stories that we heard from you in our key informant interviews. Actually, we had more than one, but I just picked two that I really wanted to share that I thought were particularly nice. And I just want to share them with you today. So in the last section of our webinar today, we're going to be talking about sort of, okay, we understand the problem now. We've looked at the data analysis. We understand what some individual employers are doing to address these issues. How do we scale up, right? How do we move from individual adult learner successes and individual employers that are doing great things to really achieving systemic change? And to do that, we need strong public policy. At the state level, advancing proven strategies, and at the federal level, really establishing frameworks both to protect what already exists, but also build towards longer-term policy wins. So our report goes in a fair bit of depth of a number of different state policy levers that we recommend to address these issues, and I've just briefly summarized them on the slide here. We're not going to try to go through all of them on today's webinar, but I did want to dig into a resource that we have available that might be useful to those of you who want to advance these policies in your state. For each of the policies listed on the slide here, we have a 50-state scan that says, essentially, does your state already have a policy in this area? And then we have a policy toolkit that says, well, if you don't have a policy in this area, or if you have one but you'd like to strengthen it, here's the components of what we think is a model policy. And here is some model legislative language that you can use to either introduce a bill in your state legislature or use with your governor's office to advance an administrative policy, and do what we call sort of steal this idea, right? You can literally cut and paste this language and use it yourself in your state. So those scans and toolkits are available on our website and on the skills equity page and on the publications page. The only one that will be out later this spring and isn't yet on that page is the work-based learning scan, but that will be out in May of this year. So watch for that coming soon. So let's dig deeper for a second. We talked earlier about industry sector partnerships and how they can bring together small and medium-sized employers in the same industry. How do you actually go about encouraging your state to fund and support those kinds of partnerships? Well, the first thing you can do is take a look at our scan and see what your state may already be doing on this front. I'm not going to go through this slide in depth right now. It's really a reference slide for you to come back to, but it sort of outlines the three components of what a state policy can consist of. Some states have a robust version that includes all three components, and some states just have one of these components in place. And that's among the states that have a policy. Obviously, a lot of states don't have a policy. And then here's an example of our sector partnership policy toolkit, which, as I mentioned, includes resources for you as well as case studies from states that have already implemented these policies, which I think is always really helpful when you're trying to talk to advocates or others in your state to say, can we do this here? What other states that we consider peers or states that we feel a little competitive with might already have done it? And then finally, we want to look at what can be done at the national level. And I know that many of you have seen the President's budget, which just recently came out, which recommends a number of cuts across both the Departments of Education and Labor. Obviously, the first most important thing, if we think about funding this work at the federal level, is to preserve the existing investments that the federal government has made and, frankly, restore some of the cuts that have happened in prior years. So I've put on this page a one-page fact sheet, which I think is a really helpful sort of boiling down to one phrase. We can't compete if we cut, right? So we as a country will not be economically competitive if we keep cutting our investments in adult education and workforce development. And that really just boils it down to one sentence. The fact sheet is one page, and I strongly encourage you, as you're contacting your congressional offices in this budget season that we're in right now with Congress, use this fact sheet to help make the argument for preserving federal investments and strengthening federal investments that need to be in place to enable this good work on the ground to continue. We also have a series of recommendations, and they're outlined in more depth in the report, that are sort of longer term. If Congress reauthorizes the Perkins Act, if Congress reauthorizes the Higher Education Act, we have some recommendations about how they can do that in a way that will benefit the kinds of service sector workers with low basic skills that we've been talking about in today's webinar. And so I encourage you, if that's an area that interests you, to dig into our full report to look at those recommendations. We have a sector partnerships recommendation for the federal level, just as we do for the state level, really around better alignment of existing federal investments and then making additional investments to really enable more communities to launch sector partnerships and to do it in industries. Retail is not an industry that has seen a lot of sector partnerships, so that would be an area, an example where there really is room for potential growth. We also have a recommendation around how to incentivize more investments by employers themselves. Currently, employers can get a tax credit for something called the Work Opportunity Tax Credit for hiring people who are exiting public benefits programs. We'd like to see that re-envisioned as a work-based learning opportunity tax credit and really incentivizing employers who are willing to offer some training or upskilling opportunities to adult learners who have low basic skills and or who are exiting public benefits programs. So again, we have a one-pager on this. It's on our website. I encourage you to check it out. So I've just given you a bunch of pretty big picture policy recommendations, and some of them, if you're a savvy advocate, you know are going to take a while to get to reality. I wanted to also give you some very bite-sized ideas of things you can do today. And the first is to make sure that policymakers, that your elected officials are getting your organization's newsletter or your other publications. Their local district office should be getting it. Their state capital or Washington, D.C. office should be getting it. You should call up those offices, ask the staffer whose job it is to work on adult education or workforce issues, and then address it to that staffer. And you should invite policymakers to visit your program or organization. They love to do in-district visits. And particularly if you have an event like a graduation or something where they could be a guest speaker, that can be a really powerful way of getting them invested in the understanding that there's good work going on in their community that can help them connect the dots between the federal policies that make that work possible and the good work that's happening in their local communities and benefiting their constituents. And then, if you're interested, we regularly organize constituent calls with members of Congress to help them learn more about the kinds of adult education and upskilling work that's going on in their districts or their states. And if you're interested in that, definitely contact NSC so that we can include you in one of those future calls. We have some reports and publications that you can use. This one on adult education is a Foundation for Middle Skill Jobs. It's a little one-pager. The Foundational Skills Report, of course, is the backbone of the findings I've been talking about on today's webinar. There's a 30-page report, but there's also two-page fact sheets about the Foundational Skills Report. So if you want something short and sweet to share with folks, that is also on our website. So summing up, what do we know? Advocacy works. We know that speaking up for adult education and upskilling really helps remind policymakers that their constituents care about these issues. There's good work going on in their districts. And it's important for them to hear from you because it's good to be the squeaky wheel, right? You want to be reminding them that you exist and that this work is important and this work requires federal investment to be sustained. So that wraps up our presentation for today's webinar. If you have follow-up questions, you can, of course, visit our website. We ask that you, if you're not already, definitely make sure you're signed up for our email list. But if you want to reach out to me specifically with any questions about the information that we presented here today or other related topics, my contact information is here on this slide, and please don't be shy about reaching out by phone or email, and I'll do my best to get back to you as quickly as I can. So thanks so much for joining us today. I hope that this was valuable for all of you, and we hope to see you again soon on a National Skills Coalition webinar. Have a great rest of your day.